It's just past noon on June 7, 2012. On the ramp at Fort Pierce, Florida, a pilot, his wife, and their 4 children are preparing for a long flight. They've just returned from the Bahamas and are now heading home to Kansas in the family's new airplane, a Pilatus PC-12. The instrument-rated private pilot has 750 hours total time, roughly 35 of which are in actual IMC. The vast majority of that instrument experience, however, is over 8 years old. In fact, until just recently, he's been almost completely inactive as a pilot, last logging time in his previous aircraft, a Beech Bonanza, in 2007. That period of inactivity ended with the purchase of the PC-12. A little over 2 weeks before today's flight, he passed a formal course of training in the aircraft and was also signed off for a flight review and instrument proficiency check. The weather for today's flight is typical for a summer afternoon in south-central Florida. Forecasts indicate various scattered and broken layers between 2,000 and 25,000 feet, with isolated rain showers and convective activity. At 12:05 p.m., November Niner 50 Kilo Alpha departs Fort Pierce northwestbound on an IFR flight plan. All seems normal as the aircraft climbs on autopilot to its cruise altitude of 26,000 feet. 27 minutes later, the aircraft is operating in IMC, likely in an area of light icing, when Miami Center points out an area of convective activity roughly 75 miles ahead. The pilot and controller discuss the situation and agree that deviations right of course are appropriate. It's the last voice communication from Niner 50 Kilo Alpha. But the aircraft's sensors continue to record. 1 minute later, for reasons the NTSB is never able to determine, the autopilot disengages while the aircraft is in a 25-degree right bank. Over the next 10 seconds, the bank angle increases to 50 degrees, and the aircraft descends 300 feet. The pilot does nothing to level the wings or arrest the descent. Instead, he initiates a test of the autopilot system. All the while, bank angle is increasing, airspeed is building, and the rate of descent skyrockets. Within 40 seconds of autopilot disengagement, the aircraft reaches a bank angle of 100 degrees and has fallen nearly 10,000 feet below its initial altitude. Now, finally, with the airspeed at 338 knots indicated, double the aircraft's maneuvering speed at that altitude, the pilot takes action. Unfortunately, it's the worst action possible. He grabs the yoke and pulls. The results are sadly predictable. Times have changed. It used to be that well-heeled owners of single-engine piston aircraft typically looked to faster piston twins as a logical next step. Now, for a variety of reasons, they often look to turboprops or even light jets. In some ways, these aircraft are actually easier to fly, but their performance is in an entirely different league, and they require a very different mindset on the part of the pilot. Formal training is as much about systems management and automation as it is hand flying. That's fine when the trainee is already accustomed to cruising in the flight levels at 300 knots. But for someone stepping up from a Bonanza, the simultaneous adjustment to dramatically higher performance, more complex systems, and a very different flight environment can be challenging to say the least. It's hardly surprising that the accident pilot, whose last aircraft was a Bonanza, was reportedly frustrated at always being behind the aircraft during training. He received a few extra lessons, but didn't heed the advice of a high-time pilot who suggested flying with a second pilot until he had more experience in the aircraft. It's not difficult to see how a well-intentioned but inexperienced solo pilot in a turbine aircraft might come to rely heavily on automation, so heavily perhaps that when confronted with an avionics issue, his immediate instinct might be to troubleshoot the system rather than fly the airplane. But there's a specific order of operations to be followed in any abnormal or emergency situation, and it's one we deviate from at great peril. Sadly, in this case, that lesson came far too late.